the worst draft mistake from every NBA team over the past 20 years. As you'll see, some teams haven't made many mistakes at all, but others would be instant championship teams had they played their cards right. And we'll get to that. For this video though, a couple things. For example, because a guy like say Steph Curry didn't get drafted until 7th, we're not calling it a mistake for all 6 teams that picked before him, just for the teams up until that point that may have needed a point guard. And the other thing is that the farther back players fall, the less we're going to consider them mistakes, because late draft picks are often surprises to everyone. We'll still mention some later picks, but not many. In the 2011 NBA draft, the Phoenix Suns made the choice to draft Markieff Morris at 13 instead of Kawhi Leonard, who wasn't taken until 15th. And this is tough to look back on, but makes a lot of sense knowing the Suns. I mean, they needed both the small and power forward positions filled, which was why Markieff split minutes between the two when he got drafted there. So they could have just as easily taken Leonard, because going into the draft, their 2 small forwards were Jared Dudley and Grant Hill, who was in his second to last season already. The Rockets could have also drafted Kawhi since they took Marcus Morris with the 14th pick, but since the Suns picked first, we're giving them this mistake. The Lakers honestly didn't have many drafting mistakes, and that's why they've consistently been good. But the one they did have was selecting Lonzo Ball 2nd overall instead of De'Aaron Fox, who was still available until he was picked 5th by the Kings. It was a move Magic Johnson wanted to make, but the final decision came down to ownership, and they made the wrong one. Now you may say this really doesn't matter because they traded him for Anthony Davis anyways, but hey, maybe if the trade would have involved De'Aaron instead of Lonzo, they would have gotten to keep some of the other assets that they traded away instead. If you go way back to 2002, you'll remember that Amari Stoudemire was drafted 9th overall straight out of high school. And looking back, it makes you question what the Nuggets were thinking taking Nicolos. Amari became a 6-time All-Star. Nicolos averaged 2 points a game. The Nuggets were terrible at the time, so they definitely could have used Amari, but it also could have meant that they never ended up getting Carmelo Anthony in the next year's draft. So I guess it's okay. Dante Exum's without a doubt one of the biggest draft busts in recent memory, since he's done nothing in the NBA. And that's bad, but it's even worse knowing that the Jazz could have taken Zach LaVine, who wasn't drafted until the 13th spot later that night. And it would have teamed him up with Gordon Hayward, Derrick Favors, and Rudy Gobert. The Blazers will always carry one of the most historically bad draft mistakes of the 2000s. As a matter of fact, before and after the 2000s, since they passed on Michael Jordan in '84 too. In that case though, they did have Clyde Drexler already, but in this case they needed both a small forward and a center equally as bad. Martell Webster was their forward and Joel Prisbilla was their center. They had a 50-50 shot but turned down the most skilled player in the NBA draft by far for the guy that wasn't as talented but could lift more weights. And we all know how that went. And 2 years before that, in 2005, they drafted Martell Webster after trading down from the number 2 spot to the number 6 spot in the draft, willingly giving up on the opportunity to draft both Deron Williams and Chris Paul at the time when Damon Stoudemire was their starting point guard. They really could have had CP3, Kevin Durant, LaMarcus Aldridge, and Brandon Roy all on the same team. So Blazers fans, I'm sorry to put you through that, but Kings fans, you're gonna need to take a seat for this one. We'll start though in 2009 because that year they needed a shooting guard and took Tyreke Evans 4th overall instead of DeMar DeRozan, who ended up going 9th. 2 years later, the 2011 draft, they take Jimmer Fredette 10th as a point/shooting guard. Then Klay Thompson gets drafted with the very next pick. The next year, okay, they really needed a power forward, but could have used a point guard too because Jimmer was a bust and Isaiah Thomas was a rookie, only averaging 11 points a game. But they picked Thomas Robinson 5th overall when Damian Lillard ended up getting taken with the very next pick. So we're talking only a 3-year span right here, and they missed out on Dame, Klay, and DeRozan. But having not picked either future All-Star shooting guard, now they needed one. So they draft Ben McLemore with the 7th pick and let CJ McCollum drop down to the 10th. Then finally, the one that still hurts Kings fans more than anything, and if any Kings fan is somehow still watching this without having collapsed, this is the one that's gonna do it, because as we know, they drafted Marvin Bagley over Luka Doncic in 2018. And one of the biggest mistakes of all time. And this is what I mean, they could be a potential championship contender if they just made a few more smart decisions. But they didn't. The Grizzlies are in a good spot in recent years, but they've had some mistakes of their own too. Like in the 2009 draft when they selected Hasheem Thabeet 2nd overall over James Harden. They did just draft OJ Mayo the year before, so it would make sense why they didn't draft a shooting guard. But they also just drafted Marc Gasol the previous year, so not really. They had a 50-50 chance. Bet on OJ and draft Hasheem, or bet on Gasol and draft Harden. And obviously they made the wrong choice. And they did the same thing a year prior when they drafted OJ, because he was drafted by them one spot ahead of Russell Westbrook. Sure, OJ would have been hard to turn down back then, but looking back it was a bad decision. Minnesota definitely holds one of the most infamous draft day mistakes really ever, because in 2009 they desperately needed a point guard, having only Sebastian Telfair at the time, and they proceeded to pass on Steph Curry 2 times in a row and picked both Ricky Rubio and Johnny Flynn over Steph. I mean, come on, they had a 2 out of 3 chance and they blew it. Fast forward 1 year later and things get worse, because now they needed a small forward, so they pick Wesley Johnson, which was a bad move already. The man never averaged double digits. But then Paul George, also a small forward, goes 10th overall, and I'd say the Wolves just can't catch a break, but it's their fault. The Atlanta Hawks' biggest mistake that they made is still costing them to this day, and you look back at the 2004 and 5 season and see that they really could have used help at every position, which is why they finished that year with a 13-69 record, and so they had the 2nd pick in the next draft. They could have drafted Deron Williams or Chris Paul, but instead they chose Marvin Williams. The Pacers' biggest mistake by far has always been selecting Kawhi Leonard in 2011, getting so close to having him on their team, but then trading him away that same night for George Hill. I don't need to say anything else. For as good as Milwaukee is these days, you might not think they've made too many draft mistakes recently over recent years, but they've had a couple big ones. Like when they needed a big man in 2007 and went with Yi Jianlian over Joakim Noah. Noah was a defensive player of the year, Jianlian played 5 seasons in the league. And aside from drafting a few players higher up that turned out to be nobodies, they also drafted Jabari Parker over Joel Embiid in 2014. And at the time, Wiggins and Parker were the clear choices to go 1 and 2 that year, with everyone saying Embiid was gonna go 3rd, because teams were worried about his injuries. But now it's turned out to be the opposite, with Jabari being the one that's injury prone, meaning they should have went with Embiid. And if things went right, that would have given them Giannis and Joel on the same team. The Knicks are basically built on bad decisions, so surprisingly there was only 2 big draft day mistakes in recent memory. The first was picking Frank Ntilikina 8th overall in 2017, when Donovan Mitchell was still available until the 13th pick. And yes, they play different positions, but come on. The Knicks needed new players at every position at that point. Their other big mistake came in 2005 when they also had the 8th overall pick, and they used it to draft big man Channing Frye. But just 2 picks later, Andrew Bynum was drafted by the Lakers. Sure, his career was pretty much over by the time he turned 25, but he helped LA to 2 championships while Frye played in New York for 2 seasons. Not a huge one for the Nets, but it was worth mentioning that in 2010 they did take Derrick Favors 3rd overall over DeMarcus Cousins. Cousins was one of the top 2 or 3 centers in the league for a while there, and Favors was never more than average. This one for the Bulls hurt because in 2006 they did draft LaMarcus Aldridge, but then traded him down right away for Tyrese Thomas. Terrible call, and I mean, that one hurts. As Philly fans remember, the 76ers had a lot of years of top picks in the draft from the process. But what they may try to forget is just how many of those turned out to be busts. Because they drafted Evan Turner 2nd overall in 2010, also over DeMarcus Cousins. They drafted Markelle Fultz over Lonzo Ball, which sure at the time seemed good, but since has turned out to be a disaster. And let's not forget they drafted Jahlil Okafor 3rd overall, when Kristaps Porzingis went to the Knicks with the very next pick. And they were that close to having a Porzingis Embiid frontcourt, but they missed out. And honestly, the 76ers had so many top picks for like a 4 or 5 year stretch, and they only ended up with 2 top players. Still good, but should have been more. And again, the Magic too. Orlando's made of terrible decisions. Bad trades, bad signings, and everything. But only one major draft mistake I could find, which was that they took Mario Hezonja 5th overall over Devin Booker. Sure, Booker surprised a lot of people coming into the league, but still, looking back, it's just sad. Then these next two for the Raptors are hard to look at because Chris Bosh needed the help and the team could have been much better. First, in the 2004 season, they had 6 different centers on their roster that year, so they drafted Rafael Arroyo 8th when they could have had Andre Iguodala to pair up with Bosh. Then 2 years later in 2006, they draft another big man to try and pair with Bosh, but this time it's Andrea Bargnani who went first overall. And that right there was terrible enough, but the fact that LaMarcus Aldridge went second and they could have had him makes it that much worse. The Celtics were also looking for a big man in the 2012 draft, so they picked both Jared Sullinger and Fab Melo. Fab Melo played 6 total games for them, and Jared Sullinger turned out to be a dud. And that hurts because they had 2 chances to draft Draymond Green and chose not to, which is a pretty rare mistake coming from the Boston Celtics. Also in the market for a power forward, the Heat in 2008 could have had Kevin Love. They had the 2nd overall pick and Love wasn't drafted until 5th. But instead they ended up with Michael Beasley. Honestly, it was an honest mistake at the time, but still one that they missed out on. That one wasn't as intense as in 2001 when the Wizards made the mistake of all mistakes and picked Kwame Brown with the 1st overall pick when they could have just went with Pau Gasol or Tyson Chandler instead. And this will always go down as one of the biggest draft mistakes of all time. The Hornets then made one of their own by selecting Michael KiddGilchrist, 1 spot ahead of Bradley Beal. We've seen Gilchrist peak as a player a long time ago, and we know that he's a solid 2-way player, but nothing more. While on the other hand, we're still seeing Beal get better every single season and average over 30 points a game. Who hold another one of the spots for the biggest draft day mistakes ever. I get that back then, the 2013 draft looked like a weak one. It's turned out to be a pretty strong one since then, but back then it was weak. But nobody made them go and pick Anthony Bennett over Victor Oladipo. And Bennett is still the biggest draft bust of all time. And that may be true, but it's not the worst mistake because Darko Milicic over Melo, Bosh, and Wade will forever be the biggest draft day mistake ever. And still doesn't make any sense to this day. Oh, and also don't forget the Pistons chose to take Brandon Knight over Kemba Walker one year. I should also not forget to mention that the Mavs, Warriors, Clippers, Rockets, and Thunder didn't have any major mistakes that I could find. So if you're a fan of them, good news, you're safe. As for the rest of you, I know you may be a little heartbroken right now from all this information, but still don't forget to drop a like and subscribe.